A ranch owner ventured into the wilderness, searching for his lost cattle on a foggy morning, telling his family he'd be back by nightfall. But he never returned home, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a loyal shepherd dog who refused to leave the ranch gate. But 8 months later, that same shepherd dog suddenly appears at the family's doorstep, carrying something in its mouth that makes everyone's blood run cold and changes the entire investigation. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment from which part of the world you're watching, because now I'm going to tell you how all of this happened. A dense fog hung low over White Rock County, Montana, blanketing the valley and obscuring the familiar ridgeline that framed the 300-acre Miller Ranch. Harold Miller sat on his weathered porch rocker, eyes squinting toward the north pasture as his daughter Sarah emerged from the house with a steaming mug of black coffee. 6 head missing from the north pasture, Harold said, accepting the mug with calloused hands. Probably found that gap in the fence by Devil's Spine again. I'll ride out and bring them back before dark. Sarah leaned against the porch railing, concern etching lines around her eyes. At 70, her father's face was as permanent as the mountain range behind them, weathered from decades under the harsh Montana sun. His gray beard and work-hardened hands told the story of a lifetime spent building the Miller Ranch into one of the most respected operations in the state. "Take your satellite phone," she reminded him. "That ravine gets no cell reception." Harold waved dismissively, the same gesture he'd used since Sarah was small. "Been working this land since before you were born, Sarah Bear. I'll be fine." The nickname pulled Sarah back to countless memories of her father's steady presence. Since her divorce 3 years ago, she and her 2 children had moved into the guest house, helping Harold maintain the ranch operations after losing her mother, Martha, to cancer. These morning coffees had become their ritual, a quiet moment before the day's demands. Last Sunday, the oak dining table had been surrounded by laughter as all 3 of Harold's grown children and 7 grandchildren gathered for their weekly dinner. The tradition had become even more sacred since Martha's passing. During the meal, Harold's loyal black and white shepherd, Buck, had stationed himself faithfully at his master's feet, occasionally receiving scraps from the little ones when Harold pretended not to notice. "Dad's Sunday roast is better than any restaurant in Helena," Sarah had declared, prompting good-natured arguments from her siblings about which of their father's dishes reigned supreme. Now Harold finished his coffee with practiced efficiency and stood, his joints protesting with audible creaks. "Tell the kids I'll be back in time for dinner, making my meatloaf tonight." By 9:30, Harold had saddled Dusty, his chestnut quarter horse, and packed a simple lunch in his saddlebags. He whistled sharply, and Buck bounded from the porch, tail wagging with anticipation for the day's adventure. Together they disappeared into the fog-shrouded landscape, Harold's tall figure gradually fading from view. Throughout the day, Sarah found herself glancing toward the window more frequently as the hours passed. By late afternoon, unease had settled in her stomach as she worked through ranch paperwork at the kitchen table. She tried calling her father's cell phone, knowing it would go straight to voicemail if he was near Devil's Spine, but needing to try anyway. The sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the fog with orange and pink hues. Sarah stood on the porch, phone pressed to her ear, as she called her brother Michael in Helena. "He should have been back by now," she said, eyes scanning the horizon. "Dad never stays out this late without checking in." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Relief flooded through Sarah as she rushed toward the barn, already planning the lecture she'd give her father about keeping his word on return times. The relief froze into dread as Dusty emerged from the mist alone, saddle still in place but reins broken, flanks scratched from branches or thorns. There was no sign of Buck or Harold. With trembling fingers, Sarah dialed Michael back. "Something's happened to Dad." Dusty came back alone. Within an hour, both Michael and their sister Elizabeth had arrived at the ranch. They formed a hasty search party, heading out on ATVs along the northern property line, calling Harold's name into the gathering darkness. Their flashlight beams cut ineffective paths through the night as temperatures dropped dangerously low. At midnight, Michael's voice crackled over the radio. I found something. Sarah and Elizabeth converged on his position near Devil's Spine Ravine, a treacherous rocky formation that dropped almost 80 feet to a creek bed below. There, leaning against a tree, was Harold's rifle. 20 yards away lay his hat, its brim crusted with what appeared to be dried blood. "I've called Sheriff Patterson," Michael told his sisters, his voice breaking. "They're sending search and rescue first thing in the morning." Michael held the blood-stained hat in his trembling hands, the dark abyss of Devil's Spine looming menacingly before him, when his radio crackled with Sarah's voice. "Michael, I just called Sheriff Patterson. He wants to know if we found any signs of a struggle or footprints that aren't Dad's." Michael scanned the area around the hat, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. No obvious signs of struggle, but there's something strange here. Marks on the ground like something was dragged. Dawn broke over Miller Ranch, transforming the once peaceful property into a command center for search operations. Sheriff Patterson's cruiser led a procession of vehicles up the gravel driveway, volunteer firefighters in their personal trucks, a search and rescue team from Helena in specialized vehicles, and several neighbors on horseback ready to join the effort. Sarah stood on the porch, clutching a framed photograph of her father taken just months earlier at the county fair. Her eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night, but her voice remained steady as she handed the photo to Sheriff Patterson, a man in his mid-50s with a salt-and-pepper mustache and eyes that had seen decades of Montana's hardships. "Your father knows this land better than anyone," Patterson assured her, his weathered hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "If anyone can survive out there, it's Harold Miller." Inside the house, Elizabeth and Michael spread detailed maps of the property across the kitchen table, marking Harold's usual routes with red pen, while volunteers crowded around, receiving assignments and coordinates. The teams deployed with dogs, drones, and thermal imaging equipment. Harold's disappearance qualified as critical due to his age and the freezing overnight temperatures. By midday, the search yielded troubling discoveries. Near the edge of Devil's Spine, scuff marks and disturbed earth suggested a possible fall. Harold's lunch bag was found unopened nearby, the sandwich inside still fresh enough to indicate it had been abandoned shortly after his departure. Most concerning was a set of unidentified tire tracks on a rarely used logging road that intersected with Harold's likely path. "Could be hunters trespassing," Sheriff Patterson said, photographing the tracks with a measuring tape placed alongside for scale. "Or it could be something else. We'll cast these and run them through the database." The first day of searching yielded no further clues. The second and third days followed the same pattern. Teams combing the increasingly familiar terrain, expanding the search perimeter, finding nothing. Sarah maintained the ranch operations mechanically, feeding livestock and handling paperwork, with the distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere. On the morning of the fourth day, Sarah collapsed on the sofa from exhaustion, finally surrendering to sleep after 36 hours awake. A scratching sound at the front door startled her awake. Opening it, she found Buck, trembling and caked with mud, his ribs visible through his matted coat. The veterinarian administered IV fluids at the kitchen table, while Buck whined continuously, attempting to stand despite his weakened condition. "He's dehydrated but otherwise remarkably healthy for what he's been through," the vet explained. "He's trying to tell you something." Sheriff Patterson observed Buck's agitated behavior, his expression thoughtful. "Let's see where he wants to go." Sarah, Patterson, and 2 deputies followed Buck across the northern property. The dog ran ahead, frequently stopping to ensure they followed, leading them repeatedly to the same area near where Harold's hat and rifle had been found. Despite intensive searching, including ground-penetrating radar in case of burial, nothing new was discovered. As days stretched into a week, hope began to fade. The initial 100-plus volunteers dwindled to 20 dedicated individuals. Television crews arrived, filming Sarah's tearful plea for information as she described her father, 5 feet 11 inches tall, 180 pounds, gray beard, last seen wearing a red flannel shirt, denim jacket, and cowboy hat. The 10th night after Harold's disappearance, the Miller siblings sat around their father's empty chair at Sunday dinner, the tradition now a hollow reminder of their loss. "I keep thinking he'll just walk through that door," Sarah whispered, watching Buck, who had taken to sleeping by the ranch gate, as if waiting for his master's return. Sheriff Patterson observed Buck's behavior while the veterinarian tried to calm him, then turned to Sarah with a grave expression. "Your father is alive, Sarah. That dog wouldn't be so desperate to get back out there if Harold were dead. What worries me is that Buck may be our only witness to what really happened at that ravine." Buck strained against his leash, pulling Sarah toward the north property for the third time that week. His determination had not waned despite the fruitless searches that followed each attempt. Sarah knelt beside him, stroking his head gently. "I know you're trying to tell us something, boy," she whispered. "I just don't understand what." 2 weeks had passed since Harold's disappearance, and the official search was beginning to lose momentum. Sheriff Patterson had been honest with Sarah that morning. Resources were limited, and without new evidence, they would soon need to scale back operations. Sarah watched as Buck finally gave up and slumped onto the porch, his eyes never leaving the horizon. His vigil at the ranch gate had become a nightly ritual, refusing to come inside until the early morning hours when exhaustion finally overcame him. That evening, the phone rang constantly with well-meaning neighbors offering theories and reported sightings. Sarah filtered each call with diminishing hope, her voice growing more mechanical with each conversation. "No, we haven't found anything new. Yes, please let the sheriff know if you see or hear anything. Thank you for your concern." The 10th Sunday without Harold cast a somber shadow over the Miller household. Sarah had insisted on maintaining the family dinner tradition, though it felt more like a wake than a celebration. Harold's grandchildren spoke in hushed tones, the youngest occasionally glancing at the empty chair at the head of the table, as if expecting their grandfather to materialize. "I keep thinking he'll just walk through that door," Sarah whispered to Michael, watching Buck, who had temporarily abandoned his post at the gate to lie beneath Harold's chair, as if holding the space for his master's return. Later that night, Sarah found herself in the living room surrounded by search maps and reports, her eyes burning with fatigue. The red markers indicating areas already searched seemed to mock her efforts. Each day without new information pushed Harold's survival chances lower, a statistical reality she refused to accept. The following morning, Sarah made her way to her father's office, a space she had avoided since his disappearance. The room held his presence strongly, the lingering scent of his aftershave, the reading glasses perched on stack of cattle breeding records, the worn leather chair indented with the shape of his body. She began methodically searching through his files, hoping to find anything that might explain what happened. The hours passed as she sifted through tax records, equipment warranties, and decades of ranch documentation. Near midnight, her fingers brushed against a folder labeled Ridgeline Mining, tucked behind his personal files. Inside, she found a series of complaint letters Harold had written about trespassing on his north property line. The most recent was dated just 3 months before his disappearance. Below these was a formal offer letter from Ridgeline Mining Corporation proposing to purchase the Miller Ranch for a substantial sum. Harold's handwritten notes in the margins were unmistakable, never selling to corporate vultures who'd tear up the earth for profit. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued reading. According to the documents, Ridgeline had been conducting exploratory surveys in the region and had shown particular interest in the northern section of their property, precisely where Harold had disappeared. Dawn was breaking as Sarah searched for Ridgeline Mining on her laptop. News articles detailed how the company had secured mineral rights to properties surrounding Miller Ranch in recent months. Their CEO, Richard Caldwell, was described as a tenacious businessman with an aggressive acquisition strategy. Sarah clicked through to Caldwell's biography, studying the face of a polished man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and practiced smile. As she typed Richard Caldwell, CEO, Ridgeline Mining into the search bar, the screen displayed a news article dated just 3 weeks before Harold's disappearance. Ridgeline Mining, announces discovery of significant copper deposit in White Rock County, with CEO Richard Caldwell promising to acquire all necessary rights for what could be the largest mining operation in the state. Sarah burst into Sheriff Patterson's office, slapping the folder containing the Ridgeline documents on his desk. "I found something." The sheriff leafed through the papers, his expression growing increasingly skeptical as he read. "Disputes over land are common, Sarah. Doesn't mean they kidnapped him." Dad rejected their offer, then disappeared while investigating cattle missing from exactly where Ridgeline had been trespassing. Sarah insisted, her voice rising. "That can't be coincidence." Patterson sighed, rubbing his mustache. "I'll look into it, but don't get your hopes up. Corporate land grabs happen all the time without turning criminal." Back in her car, Sarah slammed her palms against the steering wheel in frustration. The sheriff's lukewarm response wasn't enough. After a moment's hesitation, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd found earlier that morning. 20 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Frank Lowry in a quiet corner of Helena's oldest cafe. The retired Montana state trooper was lean and weathered, with observant eyes that seemed to catalog every detail about her. "I specialize in rural missing persons cases," Lowry explained, stirring his black coffee. "Been doing this since retiring from the force 6 years ago." "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Sarah recounted her father's disappearance, the evidence found, and her discovery about Ridgeline mining. Lowry listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "I believe you," he said finally. "These corporations have playbooks for acquiring resistant property owners. Usually it's just economic pressure, but sometimes—" His voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between them. Sarah felt a chill despite the cafe's warmth. "My retainer is $5,000, Lowry continued. "That covers 2 weeks of work. After that, it's daily rates." Sarah signed the contract without hesitation, writing a check that would significantly deplete her savings. The investment in finding her father was worth any cost. Later that week, the Miller siblings gathered around their father's kitchen table. The conversation quickly turned heated when Sarah explained about hiring Lowry. $5,000? Michael exclaimed. "Sarah, that's insane. We're already struggling to keep the ranch running." "Dad would want us to save the ranch, not waste money on a wild goose chase," he continued, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "And what if he's out there somewhere, waiting for us to find him?" Sarah countered, her eyes rimmed red from constant crying. "Would you be able to live with yourself if we gave up too soon?" December arrived with bitter cold and a somber holiday season. The Christmas tree in Harold's living room seemed to emphasize his absence rather than celebrate the season. His grandchildren hung his stocking alongside theirs, a gesture that brought both comfort and renewed pain. Meanwhile, Lowry's investigation began yielding results. He discovered that Ridgeline Mining had secured mineral rights to every property surrounding the Miller Ranch in the past year. Their geological surveys suggested a significant copper deposit running beneath the northern section of Harold's land. One frosty morning, Sarah joined Lowry as he discreetly photographed a Ridgeline facility from his car window. "Caldwell's built his reputation on aggressive acquisition," Lowry explained, noting license plates in the parking lot. "But there's never been any hint of violence or illegal activity before." They spent the afternoon visiting neighboring ranchers who had sold to Ridgeline. Most seemed satisfied with their deals, but one elderly couple spoke in hushed tones on their front porch. "They have ways of making you want to sell," the man whispered, glancing nervously at his wife. "Strange things started happening after we refused their first offer. Cattle spooked for no reason. Equipment broke down. Then the accidents." The gleaming corporate headquarters of Ridgeline Mining in downtown Helena presented a stark contrast to the rural properties they were acquiring. Sarah and Lowry sat in plush visitor chairs in the reception area, waiting nervously to meet Richard Caldwell. The CEO welcomed them with practiced charm, his smile never reaching his eyes. "My sincere condolences about your father." When Sarah confronted him about the disputes, Caldwell responded smoothly, We respect property rights. Yes, we wanted to buy Mr. Miller's land, but when he refused, we moved on. That's business. As Sarah drove home after the meeting, her phone rang with a call from an unknown number, and when she answered, a nervous voice whispered, "I work for Ridgeline. Can't say my name, but I know what happened to your father, and it wasn't an accident." Before the call abruptly disconnected, Sarah slumped against her steering wheel, her heart racing after the call disconnected. With trembling fingers, she immediately dialed Lowry's number. "Someone from Ridgeline knows about my father," she blurted when he answered. "Did you get a name? Any identifying information?" Lowry asked, his voice tense with urgency. "Nothing." They hung up too quickly. Sarah started her truck, scanning the road nervously, as if the caller might be watching. The following morning, Sarah met Lowry at his cluttered home office, where he explained the challenges they faced. "Tracing that call will be nearly impossible," he said, gesturing toward his computer. "Probably a burner phone, designed to be untraceable. But this confirms we're on the right track." December's approach brought painful reminders of the looming holiday season. While shopping for essentials in town, Sarah froze in the aisle of White Rock's small department store, her hand hovering over a carved wooden ornament reminiscent of one Harold had whittled for her when she was 8. The weight of his absence pressed down on her with renewed force. At home, Sarah and her children decorated the ranch house with Christmas lights and garlands, maintaining traditions that now felt hollow. Harold's grandchildren hung his stocking alongside theirs, a gesture so poignant that Sarah had to excuse herself to cry privately in the bathroom. Night after night, Sarah found herself startling awake at odd hours, once at 3 in the morning, convinced she'd heard her father's voice calling from the porch. The house remained silent and empty when she checked, and she noticed Buck was absent yet again. Lowry continued his investigation, discreetly interviewing former Ridgeline employees. At a remote bar outside Helena, a man who'd worked in their security department spoke cautiously. "Caldwell isn't the type to get his hands dirty," he muttered, hunched over his beer. "But he's got people who would. If someone refused to sell land, Caldwell wanted badly enough." A rare moment of connection occurred between Sarah and Elizabeth when they encountered each other at the Helena shopping mall. The sisters paused before a display of flannel shirts, both instinctively reaching for one in Harold's size. "He would have loved this," Elizabeth whispered, the shared grief momentarily bridging their disagreements about the investigation. 3 days later, Buck returned to the ranch after another extended absence. The shepherd appeared thinner than ever, his ribs visible beneath his coat, but his behavior was frantic and purposeful. He pawed at Sarah's leg, whining insistently and tugging at her sleeve. "What is it, Buck?" Sarah knelt to examine him, noticing something clutched between his teeth. Her heart stopped as she recognized the scrap of red plaid fabric. "It's Dad's. It's from his shirt." Within hours, Sheriff Patterson was examining the fabric in his office while Sarah paced anxiously. "This proves he's alive," she insisted, her voice rising with desperate hope. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Patterson cautioned, but his expression changed when the forensic technician entered with preliminary findings. "This fabric shows minimal environmental degradation," the technician explained. "Based on exposure patterns, I'd estimate it's been outdoors for 2 to 3 days, not the 2 months since Mr. Miller disappeared." The discovery reinvigorated the investigation. News crews returned to the ranch as Sarah and Lowry spread maps across the kitchen table, attempting to triangulate where Buck might have traveled based on his absence duration and condition upon return. That night, Sarah fell asleep on the couch with Buck beside her, her hand resting protectively on the dog as he remained alert, eyes fixed on the door. The following morning, she was awakened by the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. Opening the front door, she found a yellow envelope with no return address containing a single page, a blueprint of some underground structure, with the word Crescent stamped in the corner and a handwritten note. "Look in the old mines. He's still alive." Sarah stared at the yellow envelope in her trembling hands while Lowry examined the blueprint. "What the hell is Crescent?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Lowry replied, studying the detailed drawing. "But this is definitely some kind of mine shaft system. Look at these tunnel markings." The following morning found them in the musty basement of White Rock County Library, poring over dusty archive boxes containing historical mining records. The elderly librarian had directed them to a section rarely visited, where county records dating back to the 19th century were stored in acid-free boxes. "Here," Sarah said, pulling out a yellowed folder labeled Crescent Silver Mine, 1950-1973. "This has to be it." Lowry spread the documents across the table, revealing survey maps, ownership deeds, and production reports. A name on the original deed made Sarah's breath catch: Caldwell and Sons Mining. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the signature. "The mine was owned by Caldwell's family before Ridgeline even existed." Lowry's expression darkened as he compared the historical maps to the blueprint from the envelope. "The layouts match. Someone's given us the exact location of an abandoned silver mine that belonged to Richard Caldwell's family." By noon, Sarah was pounding on Sheriff Patterson's door, clutching the evidence in a folder. "This can't be coincidence," she insisted, spreading the documents across his desk. "The mine belonged to Caldwell's family before Ridgeline existed." Patterson's skepticism finally cracked as he examined the connections. He picked up his phone, dialing the county prosecutor. "Jim, it's Patterson. I need search warrants for Ridgeline Mining properties immediately. Yes, I have probable cause. We may have a kidnapping situation." While the legal machinery began turning, Lowry drove his weathered pickup truck down rural back roads with Sarah beside him. They were searching for someone who might know the mine's history personally. "Walter Jenkins worked most of the old mines in this county," Lowry explained. "If anyone knows about Crescent, it'll be him." They found Jenkins's small home at the end of a gravel road, a modest single-story house with a meticulously maintained garden. The 84-year-old former miner welcomed them with surprising vigor, his hands knotted with arthritis, but his blue eyes sharp with intelligence. "Crescent Mine?" Jenkins said, recognition flashing across his face. "Worked there nearly 20 years. Thought everyone had forgotten that hole." Jenkins spread hand-drawn maps and old photographs across his kitchen table, pointing with gnarled fingers. "Main entrance collapsed in 73, but there were other ways in." His pencil traced a ventilation shaft on one of his drawings. "This one here, hidden in a stand of pines. Nobody but the miners knew about this entrance." Sarah studied the drawing, comparing it to the blueprint from the envelope. "This matches what we found," she confirmed, excitement building in her voice. "Richard's daddy used to bring him up there when he was a boy," Jenkins added. "Little Richie Caldwell was fascinated by the mine, always asking questions about the tunnels, how deep they went." That evening, Sarah noticed Buck's absence at dinner, the third time that week. Worry creased her brow as she stared at the dog's empty food bowl. "He's trying to show us something," she told Lowry over the phone. "He keeps disappearing in the same direction." Meanwhile, a county SWAT team prepared to execute search warrants at Ridgeline's offices. Officers checked equipment and reviewed building plans while the prosecutor briefed them on legal parameters. Inside Ridgeline's conference room, Caldwell maintained a calm facade, despite the officers searching through files and computers. "This is an outrageous violation," he insisted, his attorney whispering advice in his ear. "We have nothing to hide." The following morning, Sarah, Lowry, and Jenkins climbed into Lowry's Jeep, following forgotten logging roads that hadn't seen regular use since the previous century. Jenkins pointed toward landmarks that had changed over decades, orientation skills undiminished by age. "Everything's different now," he muttered, "but those rocks I recognize." After nearly an hour, they stopped where the road became impassable. Jenkins pointed toward a dense stand of pines. "It's there. The vent shaft entrance would be right in the middle of those trees." As they cautiously approached the pine grove, a familiar bark broke the silence, and Buck emerged from the trees, his behavior more agitated than ever. But what made Sarah freeze was the shiny object hanging from his collar. Her father's old gold wedding band, which Harold would never, under any circumstances, willingly remove. Sarah's trembling fingers closed around Harold's wedding band, the gold warm against her skin despite the winter chill. He would never take this off, never. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the precious object to her chest. Sheriff Patterson immediately deployed the full resources at his disposal. Within hours, he was on his satellite phone, requesting specialized cave rescue personnel from Helena. "We have a potential hostage situation in an abandoned mine system. Need tactical team with cave experience, ASAP." Buck paced anxiously, the tracking collar newly fastened around his neck, blinking with a steady green light. The shepherd's determination had never wavered through months of searching, and now his loyalty was finally leading them to answers. A team of specialists arrived by nightfall, unloading oxygen tanks, medical supplies, and tactical gear from reinforced vehicles. The mission briefing took place under portable lights set up near the tree line, with topographical maps spread across the hood of Patterson's cruiser. "The Crescent Mine has been abandoned for decades," Patterson explained to the assembled team. "We have reason to believe Harold Miller is being held somewhere inside. The structural integrity is unknown, so proceed with extreme caution." Sarah fought vehemently when told she couldn't join the rescue team. "It's my father down there. I'm going in." Her voice brooked no argument, even as safety officers listed the dangers of the unstable mine system. At dawn, the team approached the hidden entrance that Jenkins had identified. Buck led the way confidently, his behavior showing absolute purpose as he navigated through the dense pines. The opening was partially concealed by natural growth and deliberately arranged rocks that created the appearance of a natural collapse. Cave specialists examined the entrance carefully, testing air quality and structural stability. "There's airflow," noted the lead technician, holding up a thin ribbon that fluttered gently in the darkness. "That's a good sign, means there's another exit." The descent began with Buck surprisingly allowed to accompany them, fitted with a special harness and protective booties for his paws. The narrow ventilation shaft opened into a wider tunnel, supported by ancient timber beams, some worryingly cracked with age. The rescue team's helmet lights illuminated mining markings faded by decades of darkness. "Look at this," whispered one of the tactical officers, his light falling on a disturbing discovery. Modern flashlights, recent tools, and a coil of electrical cable left at a tunnel junction. "Someone's definitely been down here recently." Following a thick extension cord that snaked through the main tunnel, the team moved deeper into the earth. Buck remained focused and determined, occasionally whining with increased urgency. The contrast between the original mine infrastructure and modern additions became starkly evident as they reached a section reinforced with new support beams. The team rounded a corner to discover a small cabin-like structure built within a larger chamber, camouflaged to blend with the rocky walls. The tactical team approached silently, weapons ready as they surrounded the structure. "FBI, on the ground!" the lead agent shouted as they breached the door, finding the cabin recently abandoned. A coffee mug still steamed on a desk beside sophisticated communications equipment and security monitors. Sarah discovered a logbook containing entries spanning the 8 months since her father's disappearance. Her hands shook as she read the most recent entry from just 3 days prior. "Miller still refuses to sign. Caldwell wants results by month's end, or will have to resolve the problem permanently." Agent Diane Mercer arrived at the scene, officially taking command of what was now a federal kidnapping investigation. "This is no longer a missing persons case," she announced, examining the evidence with practiced efficiency. "This is a federal crime with multiple perpetrators." While FBI agents processed the cabin, a forgotten radio suddenly crackled to life on the desk, and a tense, unidentified voice transmitted, "Base to Post 1. Evacuate immediately. Repeat, evacuate immediately. The old man is being moved tonight," followed by the unmistakable sound of Harold Miller shouting in protest in the background. The radio transmission galvanized the FBI team into immediate action. Agent Mercer grabbed the receiver, attempting to elicit more information, but the line had gone dead. She turned to her tactical team, her expression grave. We have confirmation that Harold Miller is alive and being moved tonight. This is now a race against time." At FBI headquarters in Helena, Richard Caldwell sat rigidly in an interrogation room, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear. Across the table, Agent Mercer spread photographs of the mine cabin and logbook entries. "Your company, your employees, your operation. Denial is no longer an option, Mr. Caldwell," she stated flatly, tapping a particularly incriminating page. Caldwell maintained his composed facade for nearly an hour before cracks began to show. His attorney requested several breaks as the evidence mounted against him. Finally, after being presented with financial records linking him directly to the remote cabin, Caldwell's control shattered. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he exclaimed, slamming his palm on the table. "Miller was just supposed to scare him into selling." His confession spilled out in disjointed fragments. "It was Marcus Miller, my head of security. He took things too far when Harold recognized him during the confrontation." While Caldwell's interrogation continued, a separate FBI team raided Marcus Miller's office at Ridgeline headquarters. Hidden behind a false panel in his desk drawer, they discovered maps marked with remote locations and a key ring labeled Cabin C. Back at the ranch, Sarah watched Buck growing increasingly agitated, pacing and whining at the door despite his exhaustion from the mine expedition. The shepherd's behavior had been their most reliable guide throughout the investigation. "Buck knows where they're taking him," Sarah insisted to Agent Mercer during a tense phone call. "He's found my father twice now. We need to trust him." Mercer initially rejected the idea as procedurally unsound, but Harold's continued captivity demanded unconventional approaches. "I can authorize a small reconnaissance team, but you follow my agent's instructions to the letter." Within an hour, Sarah found herself in an FBI tactical vehicle with 2 agents and Buck, the shepherd positioned by the window, intently scanning the passing landscape. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a storm that would complicate rescue efforts. Buck's behavior changed dramatically as they turned onto an unmarked Forest Service road. The dog's ears perked forward, his body tensing with recognition. One agent consulted a topographical map, noting they were entering an area with no registered structures or residences. The storm broke just as they discovered an almost invisible dirt track diverging from the main road. Buck became increasingly animated, whining and pawing at the window as rain began pelting the vehicle. Following the hidden path for several miles, they finally glimpsed a rustic cabin through the trees, partially concealed by natural growth but betrayed by a satellite dish and modern generator. 2 armed men patrolled the perimeter, and a van was parked behind the structure. The agents observed through binoculars from a concealed position, identifying the guards as professional security personnel based on their movements and equipment. Through a small window, Sarah caught a momentary glimpse of a gray-bearded figure that made her heart leap. "It's him! It's my father!" she whispered, gripping an agent's arm. The tactical team positioned themselves around the cabin, while rain intensified, communicating through whispered radio transmissions. The plan called for simultaneous entry through front and rear doors once backup arrived. In the crucial moment before the operation began, Buck inexplicably vanished from Sarah's side. Her panicked whisper alerted the agents, who feared the dog might compromise their position. The agents were seconds from calling off the approach when a commotion erupted inside the cabin, shouting, followed by ferocious barking and the sounds of a struggle. Somehow, Buck had found another entrance and created the perfect distraction. But when gunshots rang out, Sarah lunged impulsively toward the cabin against the direct orders of the agents. Chaos erupted as Sarah sprinted toward the cabin, her heart pounding in her ears louder than the gunshots that had just rung out. The FBI agents shouted behind her, but their voices were lost in the downpour as she reached the porch in seconds, fueled by adrenaline and maternal desperation. The door splintered inward as tactical agents rushed past her, weapons raised. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, the scene before her unfolding in terrifying slow motion. Buck had somehow entered through a rear window and was locked in combat with a guard, his teeth clamped around the man's arm as they struggled on the floor. "FBI, freeze!" The agent's commands echoed through the cabin as they secured two men in tactical gear. Sarah's eyes darted frantically around the space until they landed on a doorway to an adjacent room. She pushed past the agents and rushed through the door, freezing at the threshold. There, chained to a support beam, sat Harold Miller. His once robust frame was skeletal, his gray beard grown long and wild, his clothes hanging from his diminished body. Despite his condition, his eyes held the same determination she'd known all her life. "Took you long enough," Harold rasped, his voice hoarse but unwavering. When he saw Sarah, tears finally broke through his stoic facade. "My Sarah Bear, I knew Buck would bring you." Medics rushed to Harold's side, working quickly to assess his condition, while tactical agents cleared the rest of the property. Sarah knelt beside her father, clutching his hand as the chains were cut away from his wrists, revealing raw, infected skin beneath. "We need to get him to a hospital immediately," a paramedic said. "He's severely malnourished and has multiple untreated injuries." As they prepared to transport Harold on a stretcher, he gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "They wanted the mineral rights," he explained, his voice strained. "Caldwell found copper deposits running right under my north pasture, worth millions. Tried to buy me out last summer, but I refused." The medical team gently lifted Harold onto the stretcher, fixing an oxygen mask over his face and establishing an IV. Even in his weakened state, Harold continued to explain what had happened on that foggy October morning. "Found my cattle deliberately corralled on neighboring property," he said between labored breaths. "When I confronted the man there, didn't know his name then, I was ambushed from behind." During the ambulance ride, Harold revealed he'd been kept in various locations before being moved to the mine 3 months into his captivity. His captors, Marcus and 2 others Harold knew only as Pete and the Kid, had kept him alive while pressuring him to sign over his property. "I kept refusing," Harold said with grim satisfaction as the ambulance navigated the rain-slicked roads toward Helena. "Told them my kids would notice forgery. They couldn't kill me because they needed my signature, and they couldn't let me go because I'd seen their faces." At the hospital, doctors immediately whisked Harold into treatment while the family gathered in the waiting room. Michael and Elizabeth arrived breathless, having raced from their homes at the news of their father's rescue. When the emergency room doctor finally emerged, her expression was serious but hopeful. "Your father is remarkably resilient. He's suffering from malnutrition, exposure, and has several poorly healed fractures, including 2 ribs. There's also a severe infection in his left leg that we're particularly concerned about." Later that evening, when Harold was stabilized enough for visitors, the family gathered around his hospital bed. Buck had somehow managed to slip past hospital security and lay vigilantly at the foot of the bed. Harold reached out with trembling fingers to stroke the shepherd's head. "That dog is smarter than most people I know," Harold whispered, his voice stronger after treatment. "Found a way in through the ventilation shaft. Too small for a man, just right for him. Started bringing me rabbits, ground squirrels. Kept me alive when they'd cut back my food to break me." 3 days after the rescue, while Harold slept in the hospital under police protection, Sarah received a call from Sheriff Patterson. "We just searched Richard Caldwell's house with a federal warrant. You need to see what we found in his safe. Looks like your father wasn't the first person Ridgeline made disappear to get mineral rights." Sarah stared at the evidence spread across the table in the sheriff's office, her hands trembling as she examined documents found in Richard Caldwell's safe. "These are records of at least 3 other ranchers who disappeared after refusing to sell to Ridgeline," she whispered, the implications chilling her to the bone. Sheriff Patterson nodded grimly. "The FBI has been building a much bigger case than we realized. This goes beyond your father." Caldwell had established a pattern dating back years. Later that week, the U.S. Attorney held a press conference announcing charges against Caldwell, Marcus Miller, and 2 other Ridgeline employees. "What we're uncovering is a criminal conspiracy of alarming proportions," he explained as cameras flashed. "Corporate greed that escalated to kidnapping and attempted murder." At the rehabilitation center where Harold had been transferred, Sarah watched her father struggle through his daily physical therapy. His body was frail, but his determination remained unbroken as he gripped the parallel bars, forcing his legs to support his weight. "You're doing great, Dad," she encouraged, fighting back tears at the sight of his trembling arms. The psychological trauma manifested most clearly at night. During her overnight stays in Harold's room, Sarah would awaken to her father's screams, memories of his captivity haunting his dreams. Buck, who had been granted special permission to stay as an emotional support animal, would immediately press his body against Harold's, grounding him back to reality. Preparation for the trial consumed the family's spring. Prosecutors met regularly with Harold, impressed by his mental clarity despite concerns about his physical stamina for testimony. "You'll need to recount everything that happened," the assistant U.S. attorney explained gently. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Harold's eyes hardened with resolve. "They stole 8 months of my life. You're damn right I'm up for it." On the first day of trial, Harold entered the courtroom leaning heavily on a cane, Buck padding quietly beside him. The shepherd had been unexpectedly approved as an emotional support animal after the prosecutors witnessed how significantly his presence reduced Harold's anxiety. The courtroom fell silent as Harold took the stand. His testimony, delivered in a voice that grew stronger with each word, detailed his ordeal with unflinching clarity. When asked to identify his primary captor, Harold pointed directly at Marcus Miller, then shifted his gaze to Caldwell. "You were willing to let me die for copper," Harold stated, his voice carrying throughout the hushed courtroom. "What kind of man does that?" After Harold's testimony made national headlines, other victims began to emerge. 2 ranchers from Wyoming came forward with similar stories of intimidation and property damage following their refusals to sell to Ridgeline subsidiaries. Back at the ranch, the family implemented new security measures. Cameras monitored the perimeter, upgraded fencing surrounded the property, and an alarm system connected directly to the sheriff's office had been installed. One night, Sarah found her father sitting alone on the porch after midnight, gazing at the stars over the mountains that had defined his life. "I thought about this place every day down in that hole," he said quietly, as she sat beside him. "It was what kept me fighting." When the verdict came down, it was decisive. Caldwell received 25 years, effectively a life sentence for the 68-year-old executive. Marcus Miller and the others received substantial sentences as well. 1 year to the day after Harold's disappearance, the Miller family gathered for Sunday dinner. Harold, thinner but recovered, took his place at the head of the table. Buck settled in his customary spot at Harold's feet, vigilant as ever. Harold raised his glass, his hand steady. "To coming home," he said, his weathered hand resting on Buck's head. "And to those who never stop searching for us when we're lost." As the family toasted, Buck suddenly raised his head, ears alert, staring intently at the kitchen window, and for an unsettling moment, everyone froze, the familiar fear rushing back, until Harold chuckled softly and said, "It's all right, folks. Buck's just doing what he'll always do now, keeping watch. And thanks to him, I'm here to tell you that some stories really do have happy endings, even when you go through hell to get there."